Lord. Lord, we thank you for this day, this moment that you have given all of us. Help us, Lord, that now as we are sitting in front of you, in front of your altar, help us, Lord, that we may give you thanks for all that things that you have given to us till now. Help us, Lord, be with us, Lord, whenever we were wrong, whenever we chose the wrong path, you always showed love, and you never and you always helped us to walk in the correct path and leave the wrong one. Help us, Lord, that we may, if we have hurted you, Lord, unconsciously or consciously, Lord, we can be sorry for it. We can ask forgiveness for it. Let's prepare ourselves for the Mass. Let's prepare ourselves through this hymns before Mass. And the first song that we'll sing for you, Lord, that is the Shepherd of my soul. Let's make sign of the cross in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Shepherd of my soul, I give you full control. Wherever you may lead, I will follow. I have made a choice to listen Praise Choir welcomes you to this virtual Holy Mass. This Mass was celebrated in the Archdiocese of Toronto by Father Patrick. Before beginning the Mass, I request all of you to keep your phones in silent mode. Thank you. Let's all rise for entrance hymn.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
As we prepare ourselves to celebrate these sacred mysteries, let us acknowledge our sins. You were sent to heal the contrite of heart. Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
You came to call sinners. Christ, have mercy.
Christ, have mercy.
You are seated at the right hand of the Father to intercede for us. Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
May Almighty God have mercy on us, forgive us our sins, and bring us to everlasting life. Amen. Let us pray. May your people exalt forever, O God, in renewed youthfulness of spirit, so that rejoicing now in the restored glory of our adoption, we may look forward in confident hope to the rejoicing of the day of resurrection. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
In today's first reading, we will get to know that how Peter addresses the crowd about Lord Jesus, his obedience to death so that we might be saved.
First reading. A reading from Acts of the Apostle, chapter 2, verses 14, 22b to 28. But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. You that are Israelite, listen to what I have to say. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with deeds of power, wonders, and signs that God did through him among you. As you yourself know, this man handed over to you according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. You crucified and killed by the hand of those outside the law. But God raised him up, having freed him from death, because it was impossible for him to be held in its power. For David says concerning him, I saw the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, so that I will not be shaken. Therefore, my heart was glad, and my tongue rejoiced. Moreover, my flesh will live in hope, for you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One experience corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of gladness with your presence. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Lord, you will show me the path of life. Lord, you will show me the path of life.
Let's all rise for acclamation. In today's second reading, we will get to know that our Father is very loving and He calls us towards His holiness, and that we need to set our hope in Him. A reading from First Letter, chapter 1, verse 17 to 21. If you invoke as Father the one who judges all people impartially according to their deeds, live in reverent fear during the time of your exile. You know that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without defect or blemish. He was destined before the foundation of the world, but was revealed at the end of the ages for your sake. Through Him you have come to trust in God, who raised Him from the dead and gave Him glory, so that your faith and hope are set on God. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Let's all rise for acclamation. In today's Gospel reading, we will hear that the two disciples were going to Emmaus, and they were not able to recognize Jesus until the breaking of bread.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
Our reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. On the first day of the week, two of the disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 11 kilometers from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk alone?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleophas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word, before God and all the people. And how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive." Some of those who are with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. These were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I was in the Holy Land one time only once, with students and adults from the Newman Center when I was chaplain there, along with 10 other priests. A highlight of the trip was on the final day, when I offered Mass in the place mentioned in today's Gospel, Emmaus. Following Mass, an elderly priest said to me, "Father Pat, how did it feel to have just said Mass in the place where Jesus first spiritually introduced it to the two men on the road to Emmaus?" And I had to think about that. I was struck by his comment and the comparison of the scene in today's Gospel with what one could see now as a foreshadowing of a future Mass. For instance, as you know, at every Mass there are two main parts. The first is the liturgy of the Word, in which God speaks to us in our readings and listening of the Scripture. And then we move to the altar for the liturgy of the Eucharist. Think of that as we read again the Gospel today. Firstly, the scene takes place on the same day as the resurrection. In fact, the Scripture says these two men that met Jesus on the road had just earlier heard from the women who had gone earlier to the tomb and found it empty. The two disciples were confused and not sure what to believe, and so they headed back on the road to their town of Emmaus. Then they encountered Jesus, although they did not know it was him. And he wondered what they were talking about, and they informed him what they were thinking. As they walked along, Jesus invited them to listen as he explained the scriptures to them about how the Messiah would be revealed. They were so moved. Later they would say their hearts were on fire. As they came to their home, it was getting dark, and so they invited him for a meal. The darkness strikes me here. Jesus could have gone on. However, he enters their house. A reminder to us all that only Jesus can break the darkness of our lives. He is the light who has come into the world. It is at the meal after the blessing of the bread that Jesus suddenly disappears. And then their eyes are opened and they believe. Why did Jesus disappear? It is a reminder he's no longer with us in his physical body. He is resurrected. His real presence is now with us in a new way, through his body and blood in the Eucharist. What a great gospel for us to reflect upon today, given what we have been through these past weeks and months with closed churches, and not being able to receive the Eucharist. Perhaps this gospel is the most precious gift for us during this most difficult time. Further, I trust that it might reawaken in us a renewed longing for the gift of Jesus in the Eucharist, like never before. In the meantime, we can make a spiritual communion through our viewing the Mass online with our bishops and priests out everywhere. But let us long for the day when everyone can taste the Eucharist once again in our churches and hospitals and senior centers. Let us pray that day be soon. In conclusion, let us remember, as seen in today's Gospel, that Jesus does not leave us alone. He walks with us in this time of confusion and remains the light that breaks the darkness, coming into our homes and into our lives. He will help us until that day we can share more fully in the Eucharist again. This will be very powerful. And then, like the men in today's Gospel, our hearts will be on fire once again for the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. May God bless you. And now I invite you to join me in our profession of faith.
I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. On the third day he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven, and is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From there he will come to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. Amen.
Let us pray in a special way today to Our Lady of Good Counsel. For the intentions of all in the daily TV Mass community, and for the members of the Catholic Women's League, we offer this prayer to Our Lady of Good Counsel for her intercession on our behalf during these difficult times. Mary, Our Lady of Good Counsel, filled with the Holy Spirit, you are a faithful disciple of Jesus your Son. Intercede with your Son for us that we may be faithful to our baptism, fervent in prayer, and generous in the service we give to our sisters and brothers. May the Spirit of the living God, who graced you with the gift of counsel, lead us in the way of truth and love. With the help of your prayers, may we come to rejoice forever with you and the great company of saints in the kingdom of heaven. Amen.
We
Please pray, my brothers and sisters, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God, the Almighty Father.
May the Lord accept the sacrifice at your hands for the praise and glory of his name, for our good and good of all his holy church.
Let us pray. Receive, O Lord, we pray, these offerings of your exalted church, and as you have given her cause for such great gladness, grant also that the gifts we bring may bear fruit in perpetual happiness through Christ our Lord. Amen. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
Lift up your hearts.
We lift them up to the Lord.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
It is right and just.
It is truly right and just, our duty and our salvation, at all times to acclaim you, O Lord, but in this time above all to laud you yet more gloriously, when Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. He never ceases to offer himself for us, but defends us and ever pleads our cause before you. He is the sacrificial victim who dies no more, the Lamb once slain who lives forever. Therefore, overcome with paschal joy, every land, every people exalts in your praise, and even the heavenly powers with the angelic host sing together the unending hymn of your glory as they acclaim.
Holy, 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 Lord God of hosts. Holy, 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 Lord God of hosts. Heaven and earth are full of your glory. Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Blessed, blessed, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed, blessed, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna,
You are indeed holy, O Lord, the fount of all holiness. Make holy, therefore, these gifts, we pray, by sending down your Spirit upon them like the dewfall, so that they may become for us the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. At the time he was betrayed, he entered willingly into his passion. He took bread, and giving thanks, broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body, which will be given up for you." In a similar way, when supper was ended, he took the chalice, and once more giving thanks, he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and drink from it. For this is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will be poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in memory of me."
My Lord, my God.
The mystery of faith.
we proclaim your death, O Lord, and profess your resurrection until you come again.
we celebrate the memorial of his death and resurrection, we offer you, Lord, the bread of life and the chalice of salvation, giving thanks that you have held us worthy to be in your presence and minister to you. Humbly we pray that partaking of the body and blood of Christ, we may be gathered into one by the Holy Spirit. Remember, Lord, your church spread throughout the world and bring her to the fullness of charity, together with Francis, our Pope, Thomas, our Bishop, and all the clergy. Remember also our brothers and sisters who have fallen asleep in the hope of the resurrection, and all who have died in your mercy, welcome them into the light of your face. Have mercy on us all, we pray, that with the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, with Blessed Joseph, her spouse, with the blessed apostles and all the saints who have pleased you throughout the ages, may we merit to be co-heirs to eternal life and praise and glorify you through your Son, Jesus Christ. Through him, and with him, and in him, O God, Almighty Father, in the unity of the Holy Spirit, all glory and honor is yours forever and ever.
Amen.
At the Savior's command and formed by divine teaching, we dare to say,
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us, Lord, from evil.
Deliver us, Lord, we pray, from every evil. Graciously grant peace in our days, that by the help of your mercy we may be always free from sin and safe from all distress, as we await the blessed hope and the coming of our Savior, Jesus Christ.
For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever.
Lord Jesus Christ, who said to your apostles, peace I leave you, my peace I give you, look not on our sins, but on the faith of your church. And graciously grant your peace and unity in accordance with your will, who live and reign forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
The peace of the Lord be with you always.
And with your spirit. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world. Have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world. Have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world. Grant us peace.
Behold the Lamb of God, behold him who takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are those called to the supper of the Lamb. Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Only say the word, and my soul shall be healed.
Since we cannot receive the Holy Communion, let us remember our first Holy Communion and also our best moment when we receive the body and blood of Christ. Remembering that, let us partake in the spiritual communion by saying this prayer. O Immaculate Queen of heaven and earth, Mother of God and Mediator of every grace, I believe that your dearly beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, is truly, really, and substantially contained in the most holy sacrament. I love him above all things and long to receive him in my heart. Since now I cannot receive him sacramentally, be so good to place him spiritually in my soul and never permit me to be separated from him. Amen. Let us say the prayer after communion of St. Thomas Aquinas. I thank you, Lord, Almighty Father, everlasting God, for having been pleased, through no merit of mine, but of your great mercy alone, to feed me, a sinner, and your unworthy servant, with the precious body and blood of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. I pray that this Holy Communion may not be for my judgment and condemnation, but for my pardon and salvation. Let this Holy Communion be to me an armor of faith, a shield of goodwill, a cleansing of all vices, and a rooting out of all evil desires. May it increase love and patience, humility and obedience, and all virtues. May it be a firm defense against the evil designs of all my visible and invisible enemies, a perfect quieting of all the desires of soul and body. May this Holy Communion bring about a perfect union with you, the one true God, and at last enable me to reach eternal bliss. When you will call me, I pray that you bring me, a sinner, to the indescribable feast, where you, with your Son and the Holy Spirit, are to your saints, true light, full blessedness, everlasting joy, and perfect happiness, through the same Christ our Lord. Amen. Let us say a prayer for priest of Saint Teresa of Lisieux. O Jesus, eternal priest, keep your priests within the shelter of your sacred heart, where none may touch them. Keep unstained their anointed hands, which daily touch your sacred body. Keep unsullied their lips, daily purpled with your precious blood. Keep pure and unearthly their hearts, sweet with the sublime mark of the priesthood. Let your holy love surround them and shield them from the world's contagion. Bless their labors with abundant fruit, and may their souls to whom they minister be their joy and consolation, here and in heaven, their beautiful and everlasting crown. Amen.
Let us pray. Look with kindness upon your people, O Lord, and grant, we pray, that those you were pleased to renew by eternal mysteries may attain in their flesh the incorruptible glory of the resurrection, through Christ our Lord. Amen. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
And may Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let us go in peace.
Thanks be to God. As I kneel before you, as I bow my head in prayer,
been days that we are not able to come together for this virtual Holy Mass. We ask your pardon. Forgive us. What we started, we are not able to continue with your Spirit. Because Lord, it's your word which struck our heart that if we have not reconciled and we are coming and offering Mass, then everything nullifies. Lord, thank you for all these days while we were not able to conduct this virtual Holy Mass. But we learned lots of things with your Spirit. And Lord, as we begin this virtual Holy Mass, we are resuming this virtual Holy Mass once again. Help us to remind our mind, our body, our soul that you love a reconciled and a contrite heart. And Lord, somehow we feel that we brought that kind of heart this evening. Lord my God, never leave us, but help us that we may lead ourselves with the help of your Holy Spirit towards holiness. Lord my God, holiness is really a dream for all of us who believes in you. It's a dream. Sometimes that dream shatters down. But Lord, the Spirit given by Abba is always pushing us, pulling us. Lord, at that time, please help us that we may look on that cross and we may think like it's really impossible, but at the same time, you made it possible. Lord, while we are going from lots of ups and downs, help us that we may reflect on your words, we may reflect the smallest details where you can speak to us so that we can change ourselves. Yes, Lord, in our surrounding we have become a good person. We are trying to make ourselves better than yesterday so that we can become the best. But holiness, then also it's far, but not impossible. Lord, in this journey, help us that we never ever lose hope. And those who are listening to this virtual Holy Mass or seeing it now or in coming days, Lord, help all of us that we may never leave hope. When we become the best, I know, Lord, we will be able to hear you. While we are hearing you, will move to greatness, and hence like you will be glorifying yourself through us, and next will be made perfect, and next holiness. What I feel, what we feel, Lord, keep your mercy flowing into us, our families, our surroundings, whether it is a healthy or unhealthy surrounding. Please, Lord, never leave us and help us that we may imitate you and let our surrounding realize that we are not there, but you are there. You are talking through us to them. Yes, Lord my God, we surrender ourselves and help us that we may move with thy Spirit. My Lord's Mother and my Mother, Mama Mary, please intercede with all the angels and saints so that we may come where you live. For this we will be praying, our Father, who art
God in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us, Lord, from evil. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee.
Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Let's say memorare together.
Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession, was left unaided. Inspired with this confidence, I fly to thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me.
Amen.
Queen of heaven, rejoice now. Alleluia. Rejoice, for he who married no despair. Alleluia. He is risen as he foretold. Alleluia. Pray for us to the Father. Alleluia. Rejoice and be glad, O Virgin Mary. Alleluia. For the Lord has truly risen. Alleluia. Let us pray. O God, you came to give joy to the world through the resurrection of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Grant, we beseech you, that through his mother, the Virgin Mary, we may obtain the joys of everlasting life through the same Christ our Lord. Amen.
All glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Virgin Mary,
Pray for us.
Saint Joseph,
Pray for us.
Saint Josemaria Escriva,
Pray for us.
Saint Faustina,
Pray for us.
Saint Mother Teresa,
Pray for us.
Saint John Paul II.
Pray for us.
Let's all make sign of the cross.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, friends, and have a blessed week ahead. Stay safe and take precautions. And even we are happy that we are resuming after some days virtual adoration, which will be in the morning at 7:30 a.m. and virtual Holy Mass in the evening at 6. So please join us.